Bleed is a game that, despite its title, has literally zero blood in it somehow. Crazy, right? Bleed is a series of 2D twin-stick shooter action platformer games by Ian Campbell, released for PC and all major consoles with a huge focus on high-octane combat and intense bosses. But let's break it down a little more. The first game was released in 2013, with its sequel releasing in 2017. Both are relatively similar in most aspects, but I'll point out any specific differences when necessary. Gameplay across games is nearly identical. Run and gun your way through each stage, defeating enemies and using your ability to slow time in case you need more time to react to things, and use your 3-meter dashes to get through the interesting platforming challenges each level presents, as well as allowing you to dodge attacks more easily during boss fights. Both games also allow you to equip different weapons to deal with different situations, like a sword that could reflect some projectiles or a laser rifle to pierce through shields. Both games are pretty focused on making you feel extremely powerful without completely breaking the game, which is pretty nice. The music is pretty different between the two games. While the first game goes for an energetic chiptune style of music, the second game uses intense synth rock to hype you up for its more action-packed levels. Both work well for each respective game, though I do prefer the synth rock because guitars. Story is probably where the two games differ the most, but honestly it's not even that important. The first game sees you controlling Rin on her quest to become the greatest hero of all time by defeating all the other heroes to claim the title. And the second game, once again starring Rin, this time requires her to actually be a hero and save the world. It's a simple plot, but this game really doesn't need a massively interesting story to be super engaging. Visuals are great across both games, with detailed pixel art that manages to be both simple and very expressive. And while the second game definitely looks a lot better, the first game is still by no means bad compared to it. Well, now that I've done my best to give objective descriptions of each game, which one do I personally think is the best? Well, the second game does almost everything better than the first. The improved music and visuals, as well as a few changes to gameplay, make everything much flashier and more spectacular. But that's the issue. The second game feels a whole lot more over-exaggerated, but at the same time also makes you way more powerful than you were in the first game, and therefore it's a lot less satisfying. Even on the hardest difficulty, nearly every standard enemy dies in one hit to any of your attacks, and the last two levels are literally just boss battles, whereas the first game had 7 full stages. And the levels in Bleed 2 flow into each other directly to the point that there's cutscenes to transition between them, but that just makes them feel all even less unique. Bleed 2's weapon system is also a lot more limited than the first game's. In the first game, you could buy new weapons and upgrades to your health and energy meter by using the score you got from playing stages as currency, with a few unlockable weapons for beating the game on certain difficulties. Bleed 2 totally removes the shop as well as the upgrades, meaning that there's way less weapons, and because of this, there are even more problems. Your first playthrough will restrict you to only being able to use the dual pistols and katana, and because the katana and pistols are now combined into one weapon instead of being separate, you can now fire at enemies and reflect projectiles without needing to switch weapons at all. In the first game, not only could you only have 2 weapons equipped at once, the katana was also only unlockable by purchasing it in the shop. Being able to reflect projectiles meant you not only had to spend points to unlock the weapon, but also to give up the ability to attack at a long range while you were using the katana. But the second game removes this aspect completely. Despite the fact you can reflect projectiles from the start, the game doesn't feel balanced around this, making it a lot easier because most projectiles aren't a threat anymore. But the weapon system wasn't the only thing the second game does a lot worse. It may have a lot more bosses, but most of those bosses are almost just identical copy-paste from the first game, with a couple new attacks. Every main level boss from the original Bleed is here in some form, and the cores from the first game show up here too with minimal alterations. The new bosses are great, but so many of them are just recycled content from the original game. In comparison to the first game, Bleed 2 is style over substance while still managing to be a pretty decent game. Bleed was a bit unpolished, but it felt a whole lot more unique and fun than the second game. Maybe the issues could be addressed in a possible third game, but honestly another game in the series seems pretty unlikely. Final scores. Bleed. Gameplay, 45 out of 50. Music, 16 out of 20. Story, 12 out of 20. Visuals, 9 out of 10. Final score for Bleed, 90 out of 100. Bleed 2. Gameplay, 30 out of 50. Music, 20 out of 20. Story, 13 out of 20. Visuals, 10 out of 10. Final score for Bleed 2, 73 out of 100. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. If anything sounded weird with my voice, please tell me. I recently got a new microphone and I still need to make sure everything with it sounds okay, so any feedback is appreciated.